Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non-monogamy for messy people like us. I'm Sarah, a queer therapist, writer, and journalist.
And I'm her husband, Alex, a communications professional and educator.
And I am Jessica, here producing and resident monogamist for the podcast.
Today we have a very special guest. She says she's turned her love of people into her life's work. She's a Seattle-based sex worker, a self-deprecating dog mom, a fellow communications, media, and journalism nerd. Vaughn Wolff, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited for us to have this conversation. There's so many things just in your bio that I can't wait to talk about. But to dive right in, tell me about your dogs.
Oh, my dogs. Okay, so thanks for going easy on me. My girls, so they're two pit bulls, rescue pit bulls who are not the quote-unquote good dogs, but I have a 6-foot fence around my house, a lot of time on my hands, and a lot of determination, so I've made it work. Aww. And they're just I say self-deprecating dog mom because I know that dogs are not children. They're not human children. I'm not one of those people, sort of, but I go there sometimes. And so they're just my world. And the reason I say, hey, I don't want to be out later than midnight. I got to go home and stare into the eyes of my babies.
It's great to have that excuse.
It is.
Alex and I talk about that all the time. I think especially in the moments, and maybe you can relate to this, where you're just like in the thick of it with caregiving to a creature, a child. Yes. Yeah. And you're like, okay, wait, what was good about this? Why do we do this?
The only good thing is that you get to like leave parties early.
Yes.
And go home early because you have to relieve the bababysitter or whatever.
At very bad moments, at our rock bottom moments, we're like, but remember, they're an excuse for canceling on anything.
I love it.
Yep. All right. So what about sex work? Let's talk about that next. We'll definitely be back to discuss dog moms and sick kids and excuses more.
We all know why everybody tuned in. It was to talk about dogs.
It was to talk about pit bulls, obviously.
Dog talk.
Dog talk.
I would be on a dog talk podcast if anyone's interested.
That'll be a spin-off podcast of this. I like that. Tell us a little bit about your background in sex work. I love this part of your bio that you say you've turned your love of people into your life's work. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So I was using my degree in journalism as a social worker. Nope, I was not. I was just someone with a degree that could get a job at a shelter when I was 20. And so I do have a degree in journalism, and I did do that for a while, but I started focusing more on social work stuff. The work was more consistent, a lot more consistent. And at the time, I wasn't raised with a lot of money or a lot of historical wealth or any historical wealth, really. So it was a choice. My choice to be a social worker was, based on needing consistent work. And so I talk about this because it actually does directly relate to my job currently as a sex worker. But I was a social worker for over 12 years. I worked with women and kids who'd experienced domestic violence and loved my clients. My clients were amazing. They came from all different backgrounds and were people who had been through a lot. So one reason I wanted to leave that job is because people in charge of programming didn't quite understand what the people in their programs needed in order to, restart life. A lot of folks who've been through DV have been made homeless because of it. So getting them in housing and a lot of the ways that we could help them I was directly blocked from doing what I knew was a good thing. So by that time, I was pretty burnt out by the time I was in my early 30s. So I was 30 and I had dreams. I wanted to buy a house. I wanted to travel. And the job I was in didn't allow for that financially. And I had a few friends who were sex workers. And I said, hey, maybe I should try this out. I do happen to need the money. And so began my career as Vaughn 6 years ago, with the helpful with the helpful guidance of a few friends who were really kind. Um, and that's sort of how I started. And I noticed almost immediately that my skills as someone who'd worked with folks in my previous profession directly related to the new one I was in. And that I was good at it for that reason, sort of making the immediate connection that was needed to facilitate a comfortable experience. That is something that was absolutely a boon when I was starting sex work. De-escalating. When I started, it wasn't, I was being as safe as I could be, but there were times when things got a little iffy because I didn't quite know how to screen as well as I do now. And so that came in handy. And so from there, yeah, I kind of went from there, and gosh, 6 years ago, that's nothing and everything, right? Like feels like forever, but it's really not that long. So now I'm 37 and have achieved most of my financial goals. And now I'm at the point in my job as a sex worker where I can be a little more picky about who I see. I think I was talking with a friend, but I said, if you spend enough time doing this job regularly, you're going to turn into who you hang out with. And that's the same with any job, right? Who you surround yourself with is kind of who rubs off on you more, and then you pick up those traits. So in the last few years, I've been able to be a little more selective about who I see, which is awesome. And also, I want to say that my experience is vastly different than every other sex worker's experience. So, um, yeah, and I could go into that more, but this is my own experience. I'm speaking for myself only. I know it's hard sometimes for people to understand and to process that a group like mine has varied experiences. And I don't think that's an evil thing that they're doing, but my experience is my own, right? So,
Yeah. And we were
yeah.
talking a lot about how, before we got on with you, just about how, as a media person, you've probably, I guess anybody in any profession probably feels this, but their profession is probably not depicted very accurately by the media.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like just the ways that for people who haven't been a sex worker or worked with a sex worker, like what do we have wrong about it?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things people have wrong about it. I think one thing that pops into my mind is that this industry is somehow more evil or exploitative than other industries can be. Um, and I think that's up in the idea that, I mean, the US was founded by Puritans, and so sex was this obsession they had. And so, because the job is based on the obsession that our country was partially born from, people sort of just have these preconceived notions about what sex should be, even if they're super progressive, right? So, I think that the nonprofit industrial complex is incredibly exploitative. And I think that they have it wrong mostly. And when people say they don't respect my job, I wonder, would I respect your job? I don't know what you do. I think it's, wrong to drill for oil. I don't respect that. But like, you don't see me trying to criminalize people for it. And so that's something that I think of is something people have wrong about my industry. And it's bad. Yeah, it is bad. And I think most industries are bad.
That's interesting. Just thinking about how, because of the puritanical obsession with sex in this country, sex work as an industry is singled out as kind of assumed to be exploitative and bad, or
Right.
uniquely exploitative and bad.
Yeah,
And
uniquely, yes.
right. And I really appreciate the comparison to like people who are involved in, say, an extractive industry, like oil drilling, for example, whether or
Yeah.
not you ethically or morally agree with that,
Yeah.
saying that the assumption is that it should be criminalized or that people involved in it are bad is, we don't do that. with any other industry.
We don't.
Just going back for a moment, Vaughn, you said something about how you feel like you become the people you hang out with. And you also mentioned that having some of the qualities that you developed through being in social work in particular have helped you in this job. I just wanted to touch back on both of those things because they really stood out to me. First of all, I guess my first question is, with the clients that you now see, what are some of the qualities that you notice or look for in clients specifically? And then, I'll start there. I think that's my first question.
Oh, that's a great question. I immediately look for someone who, in the screening process, who fills out my form. That shows me that they are willing to take direction and they respect and understand that I am a professional. So that signals that to me immediately. Let's see what else. Being open, just about life in general, experiences in general. People who are, they don't have to have tons of life experience. I mean, I don't. Maybe have more than the average bear, but I study things like astrology. I'm in school for astrology, and you don't have to believe it, but when someone responds positively, it shows that they're secure in their own beliefs, and they might say, "Oh, I don't know anything about that, but that's interesting." And people do shut down too. I mean, there's that joke about how men hate astrology, but a lot of my long running clients have no interest in it at all, but are courteous when I talk about it. And open to ideas, I guess. They don't have to be just like me, but and I don't have to be just like them, but being open to being around people who are different. I also look for kindness when we're in public together. So courtesy and kindness to wait staff is huge for me. If I don't see that's a fast track to me not seeing someone again. It's,
I feel like these are also good rules for life.
Yeah, for basically anything.
Well, they are, right? And that's the thing, is that this is my life. And so who you hang out with is who you kind of become. So and that's true for sex work as well. I think that we go into this, or I went into this thinking like, oh, I'm going to deal with a lot of assholes. And I have. But I think that it's okay to say that I don't have to also. And if someone's out there going into this work, just keep that in mind. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that makes me want to ask, like, I think that the average person might assume that your clients there are more assholes represented in your clients, in people that are going to see a sex worker, than the average population. Is that something that you found?
Okay, good question. So I think that there are more predators because we are criminalized, and predators know they can get away with hurting us. That is true. Predators know that they can get away with hurting us, so they come for us more. It's not because we are less worthy of love, care, and respect, but it is because of criminalization alone that happens. Because if this was decriminalized, we could very easily handle situations a lot differently than we're given the tools to now, right? And so speaking to that right away about criminalization, but even people who are physically safe, but sort of mentally, emotionally jarring or hard to work with, I think there may be more than the average coming to us. And I think that's hard for us a lot, of course. But I think that there are a lot of really great clients out there too. There really are. And I think that we actually lose a lot of great clients because of criminalization. The good people are scared of getting caught, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah. And so when people say, oh, if it's decriminalized, prices are going to shoot down, a buyer's market, whatever. And I just say, I mean, it remains to be seen and we'll probably never know. But honestly, I think it'll be a huge influx of really good clients. And uh, yeah, I think, yeah. So those are some of my reflections. Also, when I started out, I did think that I assumed this too. I had this idea too. And so I sort of, and because I had financial goals I hadn't met yet, I was more willing to entertain people who were less than courteous. Um, and once I hit those financial goals, it just wasn't something that I needed to do anymore. So,
It's really interesting. I think there's a segue into talking about non-monogamy here,
yeah.
in the sense that because of our culture's obsessive morality around sex and sexuality, I think a lot of folks don't find themselves having the opportunity to assess for themselves what they actually feel about those things, right? So
Yeah.
in regards to sex work, I would be so curious to just like do a general poll of people and see how many folks have ever actually stopped and asked themselves, like, what do I think about this and why? Or how many people have just absorbed from the culture whatever those misconceptions or messages are that you were describing, that it's more exploitative, uniquely exploitative, that there's something morally wrong with it. And I think similarly with non-monogamy, I mean, if there's a segue here, I'm looking to find it. I think a lot of people, we absorb these messages about sex, sexuality, morality, and I say this all the time to my own clients as a therapist. These messages are very easy to absorb and can be a lot harder to extract and examine. So I was thinking about that as you were talking, that it's the water that we swim in, it's the air that we breathe. And I think we rarely take the time out to really ask ourselves, what do we think about this and why?
Yeah, and I think correlates to, and I wish too that we could collect data. God, I love data. I love it. But because of criminalization, we really can't do anything huge and serious. But I would say there are more poly sex workers than the average industry, because we have had time to review our relationships with sex, and intimacy and romance. So while it's really important to say that, no, absolutely not all sex workers are poly. A lot are monogamous, but I think that we are sort of uniquely situated to have had those moments of self-reflection, as do our partners have, as well as our partners have needed to do that work too, which translates well to being poly, but is not the same thing, but it can be helpful.
I want to dig into all of that. Before we do, Vaughn, I noticed there's a light clicking on your side, and I was wondering, I'm like, is that a little bulldog's tag or something
Oh
on your
God, no,
computer?
that's a pin. I'm gonna stop the clicking. Stop the click. Done.
That reminds me of It's funny. That reminds me of something that a journalism professor once told me. It was a documentarian, like a documentary professor. They were like, never let the person you're interviewing have a pen.
Oh, yeah.
They're like, because they'll just start tapping it.
You guys,
We should have taken your pens away.
I remember that now. Okay, no problem. I'm glad I checked.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so interesting just that like, I guess when you're working in a field that's criminalized, like it's much more likely that people are going to be more open-minded about things that have stigmas around them, including non-monogamy or polyamory. But yeah, obviously there are some sex workers, it sounds like, that are monogamous and some that are not.
Would you tell us a little bit more about that, Vaughn? This is a great example of things, I think, really lazy assumptions people might make about sex workers. Tell us about the distinction for sex workers around monogamy and non-monogamy, and why people might have a misimpression about that.
Yeah, I think that I can see where the assumption is coming from. We are not taught to value the labor of intimacy and the labor of sex, because it has been feminized labor, right? And folks who are seen as lesser than have traditionally done sexual labor. So it is sort of inherently in our culture seen as something that should just sort of be free and given, right? And so that assumption directly correlates to the idea that, oh, if like sex work is not actually work, it's just something someone does for fun because they like their clients. If you like you're not allowed to like your clients. That's sometimes people get into this, especially in relationships and monogamous relationships. I've seen it where if a worker actually has a good time at work, then that feels like cheating to the other partner. Because they should just be not having fun at work. Why would you have fun and see how that's messed up? Like,
Interesting.
if you worked at FedEx and had fun with your coworker, your partner's not going to be mad at you and say, you didn't high five me like you high five Jim. But that's, and sex is not a high five, but it could be. I mean, I hope it is sometimes. I've high fived before. But
there can be high five moments in sex.
Sure.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Can I ask, does being a professional change your orientation towards sex, in your private life?
It does. It does. It makes me pickier. It's made me pickier. And also, I'm so busy with work stuff, and it's not always direct appointments, but just work things that, and I was going to mention this, I honestly don't have time to date. And I haven't for a few years. The occasional hookup happens, but nothing that is ongoing because I put a lot of time and intention in relationships. And at this point, so I have other projects, my own relationship, and barely have any time for others. But yeah, it has changed. It's made me pickier. It's taken up a lot of my time. And it has changed my relationship to sex. I think I'm less likely to want to have it with someone new or try to date someone new.
Sarah's like rolling.
I'm doing like some
faces here.
heavy nodding over here.
Does this relate to like being a therapist as well?
Oh my gosh, please take over. I'm like
so interesting, Vaughn. Yeah, I was just like going down this rabbit hole listening to you talk. You said sex and emotional intimacy is this feminized labor that is often culturally been seen as something that should be given away for free, not valued, can be extracted by people who have more social power than you. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about being a therapist. That in many ways, my job is about like holding space for people's complex emotions, being a safe space for taboo ideas, thoughts, fears, being a place where they can go and explore things that maybe they can't explore in other parts of their lives.
Yes.
And that's a big part of what I do. And I'm only about 3 years into doing that. So I have half the time that you do.
Yeah.
But I have absolutely seen it impact the way I think about my personal relationships. And when you said I'm way more picky and I don't want to date as much, I was like,
Yep.
Because there's like, and I'm kind of thinking out loud, so jump in if I'm saying anything that sounds really off base here. But in a way, the novelty of, creating emotional intimacy with someone is not there for me because that's what I do for my work. So if I want to create that intimacy with someone, it has to be someone that I really want to create it with. It's like the act of doing itself is not as interesting to me.
Yep. Bing, 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 ding, ding, ding. That I share those feelings. That's so cool. I'm so excited to learn something about myself today. Yes.
Likewise.
That's, I really do feel that. And I'm not shut off from people. I actually feel more prepared to handle intimacy than I ever have. And I think that's come with age and also the gift of my work. And having to understand my own boundaries over the years. Those took years to develop. But it is there. And
so I think that a lot of folks, myself included, before I started practicing non-monogamy, I was just like, this is something that is defined by having sex with multiple people. This is the first definition of non-monogamy. And as I've entered into non-monogamy and learned so much more about it and learned so much more about myself, I have to like laugh at how not that it is for me. But sometimes that can be hard to put my finger on.
Like just because it's about things other than sex.
Because it's about things other than sex for me. I mean, sex is included in it, but it is not defined by sex for me. So I wanted to ask you about that, Vaughn.
Yeah, so I think, let's see, partners of monogamous sex workers, and I can't speak to. It's not my personal experience, too. I have to say that out loud. I am not a monogamous person, but just from what I've seen, and so it is anecdotal. They see their partner. I don't know. Maybe it's okay for their partner to have sex with other people, but that emotional intimacy is too much for them. Which could be just something like having fun or having had a good day at work. That's where they feel threatened because they see our work as only sexual labor and not emotional labor as
Right.
well. Yeah, I think that's something.
Vaughn, you're blowing my mind right now. I'm just realizing, going back to the FedEx example and this idea of work and what is legal and criminalized and so on and so forth, what I do at work on any given day would be considered cheating by a lot of monogamous standards if it
Yes.
weren't legal,
Yep.
right? Like I sit in session.
Like building emotional intimacy with people.
I talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
sex. I talk about like their most intimate experiences, secrets. They tell me things that they have never told anyone else, right? They tell me about sexual experiences that they've had. They talk about being attracted to me, right? Like all of this. Imagine that was my FedEx worker
It never
friend,
occurred
right?
to me to be jealous of that, but
Yeah.
partly because you're getting paid, so I'm just glad you're bringing home.
Right. Well, the money helps. No, but my point being, it's so interesting to think about how no one would characterize it that way in large part because it's legal.
Oh, yeah. We talk about that in sex work circles all the time.
Okay, so since we're on the subject, Sarah and I both had questions that we really wanted to ask you, and we're going to get back to some non-monogamy stuff in a minute. But first, when we were talking about having you on the show, it occurred to me we were on a walk and we were having a conversation about like male sexuality and how hard it is to kind of understand because men, as a general rule, tend to be so sort of like closed off about it, and our cultural depictions of it are so sort of like exaggerated. And so many men that I know are like, oh, that doesn't really reflect my experience or what I think. And then it occurred to me that like, oh, Vaughn is probably gonna have some interesting things to say about that, having been like exposed to a lot of different men's sexuality in like a pretty intimate way. So my question is, what is our deal? What's going on?
Do you want to know the deal?
I want to know the deal. Yeah.
Deal, baby.
Okay, tell us the deal.
Is that in the United States, largely by age 10, you're not allowed to hug anyone except for your mom or your sisters and maybe your dad. Like, touch is removed almost immediately from boys at too young of an age. And suddenly everything is assumed to be sexual coming from you. And so that physical intimacy that all humans require is removed, I think, far too young. And any man who wants to give his son or his whatever a hug is seen as a predator. And maybe a predator. Hey, actually, he may be a predator. I don't know. But I think that boys are socialized in the United States, from what I've witnessed, in a way that removes physical, non-sexual physical intimacy far too soon. And so you go from being able to hug your sisters and your mom and maybe your dad to then getting a girlfriend, and that's the only other person you can touch unless you're a wrestler or a football player. And then you have to go through that intricate path to being able to touch another man without being seen as, the vilified archetype of gay. So it's just, I think masculinity is really a controlled thing in our society. And I think it gets really confusing as you grow older because you're actually really nuanced people, sort of thrown into, in a lot of ways, this cookie cutter idea of what it means to be a grown up and to be a man. And a lot of people work through it. A lot of people don't. There's way more nuance than what I've just said. A lot of people's experiences are different from what I just said, but that's sort of my general
So
line on it.
do you see the men who see you as like when they're with you, are they kind of like breaking through that and being more of themselves? Or do you think you often see them just kind of like projecting?
I like to think I facilitate an experience where people feel like they can be more themselves.
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope that that's what's happening. I hope that that's where I am at in my job, and I'm able to kind of call those people to me and then facilitate that. Yeah.
Vaughn, I'm really moved by your description of that, and I like found myself feeling emotional thinking about the way we start policing boys in
Yeah.
that way at such an early age. And I have an almost 7-year-old son, and you absolutely see it. I would
Right?
say, especially
Yeah.
in this past year, you can just see that happening. And as I was listening to you talk, I was just struck by how we treat masculinity and male sexuality like something that is incredibly dangerous. And I was wondering why. Why do you think that is? Why do we treat it as something so dangerous?
I think because it is used as a weapon sometimes, and it's been used as a weapon enough that people are scared. And I think that it's a shitty cycle. It's a bad cycle of abuse, right? And so the most common way someone is abused is by someone in their family, sexually abused, and damage has been done over generations. And we live in a culture that does not that values aggression, that values that doesn't value healing and care and touch. Right, the lowest paid workers. Look at who the lowest paid workers are. They work with children and do domestic labor and work in agriculture, but all of which are incredibly nurturing, essentially nurturing either directly or indirectly. And the highest paid, who are the highest paid, I'm not sure, but I think it's the people who are best at conquering, right? So I think that that is what it is. I'm not advocating for a party or a political stance around that even. I'm just saying what's happening, and saying that that will mean that healing from trauma that happens is not going to be prioritized. And a lot of trauma has happened through the weaponization of male sexuality, of what male sexuality, quote unquote, should be. And I cannot say enough that men in general are not inherently violent people. I just don't believe it. I just believe that we live in a culture that has sort of weaponized this thing that they've made, or this this outcome that has been desired and has been seen as profitable. And who do you have left is the people who've survived it, and then the people who've done it themselves, and the people who've been dehumanized enough to do it themselves. And yeah.
And I'm just thinking also about how in a racist, sexist, extractive, capitalist culture like this, privilege is defended in the most violent and brutal ways, right? Or protected. Privilege is protected in these really violent and brutal ways. And that may also help us explain or understand this incredible fear of male sexuality and our reactions to it.
Yep. And that's going to look different from male to, like, from person to person as well, because Black men's sexuality is vilified in a very specific way. White men's sexuality is vilified in a very specific way. So those are going to be vastly different, just depending on who they are or who they're seen as,
Right.
and how they're treated by power.
Right. And their relative proximity to it.
Right. So when I say all of that, it is not all encompassing. It's important for me to say of everyone's experiences or how all sex workers think about it. But yeah, I think that men's sexuality is really dehumanized, and I hate that because they don't deserve that. I think of all the little boys, and I'm like desperately hoping that they have other options other than being cut off emotionally and physically.
Do you think about your work with men as like healing that somehow, or like as do you think it's like a liberatory experience for your clients?
I think that some aspects of my work can be liberatory for them. I think that they mostly take what they can get from that. I wouldn't say I facilitate a liberatory experience on purpose, if that makes any sense.
It just
You
happened.
know, and I think I think of the clients I work with who are a little older, who were raised in a very specific kind of masculinity that was really, really, really hard. Um, and and a few people who I'm close with, clients who I'm close with, who were denied other kinds of healing because of the masculinity they were raised in, um, are it's sort of a gateway. Like hanging out with me, right, is a bit of a gateway of being like, hey, don't be stressed about this or this, and they've never been told that. They didn't understand it was an option. So I think that it's liberating, perhaps, if that what I just said makes sense, perhaps in that context.
Wow. I love this line of conversation. I'm really appreciating it. Wondering if we can fold in sex
Yes.
work and non-monogamy again, and talk a little bit about that. Alex, I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to think about the ways that, certainly there are some ways that sex work might, well, I guess to dial it back a second, a lot of the people who listen to our podcast are people who are either like kind of very early on in a non-monogamy journey or opening a relationship or thinking about it, and kind of like exploring that. And that's why they're listening probably. So I'm just curious about ways that sex work can kind of fit into that and what your thoughts are about that. And I guess the things that come up for me, and you've probably experienced some of these things or had clients who were doing this, but just like the first time that you're having sex outside of a long-term relationship, like I'm betting for most people they're not going to a sex worker, but I could see some reasonable appeal to taking that approach because of the catching feelings thing, right? Like you're sort of like getting the sex part out of the way without a relationship around it. Does that make sense?
Okay, so here's what's interesting. A lot of the clients I have who are in non-monogamous relationships come to me because they are sensitive guys who know that they need a professional to start with because they can't just be intimate with anyone. They want someone to sort of guide the experience, and have been with their partner for many years and just are interested and want to do this thing, but know that it might not go the way they want it to. And because they've sort of just been okay. So I need to explain one observation I've had as a sex worker is that the kind of sex you've been having is the kind of sex your body is trained to have. And so you might not elicit the reactions you want from your body if you start having it differently. And that could be a different partner. That could be a different position. That could be a different whatever. And so some people maybe know that or instinctually know that. And so they want to come to someone who would have the tools to sort of work with and around that. And that's a good number of the non-monogamous clients I've seen. That's kind of why they're coming to me. They're like, I want to start, in this way. And they've been having sex with the same person for 20 years, 15 years, whatever. And they're like, what is this? Is this a thing? Or is this a thing I just do with my person? Or like, they're just kind of checking in, which is cool too.
Yeah, I guess I'm glad to hear people do that because it does seem like a great and sort of self-knowing thing to do. Like, I'm not going to involve another person who, I'm building a relationship with right away, but like I'm going to, kind of work some stuff out and take responsibility on my own first.
Yeah. And have a person who knows how to kind of work with them on that. And take that responsibility thing and the catching feelings thing. Absolutely is what I've seen. I've also seen couples who, I don't know if they identify as non-monogamous, but the partner is like, hey, look, I don't want to have sex anymore. Maybe there's a physical thing happening. Maybe it's just not happening for the other partner anymore, but they're still madly in love. And they say, yep, you can absolutely, see escorts, keep it in on the rails or whatever and do your thing. And then, come home to me. So I've seen that too.
I really love these examples. I'm wondering, you've been working as a sex worker for 6 years, so, and you were talking about how it's hard to gather data. So I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'm wondering, have you seen more of a trend in the direction of people who are exploring non-traditional relationships or non-monogamy come to sex workers?
Anecdotally, I would say yes, but I would have a few addendums or a few asterisks for that. Is that, or at least one, is that I think I've sort of built up more of a reputation in my city. It's clear that I'm a professional. And I'm a little older too than what people would consider the median age of a sex worker. So I'm 37. I tell people I'm 37. So I could see how that could be a little more appealing to people who are being intentional in this way, especially partners being okay with their partners seeing someone, they're like, oh, okay, she's a professional. She's in her late 30s. Like, this seems chill. But also, I think even that aside, yes, I think people are way more open. Absolutely. Do you guys see more? Because my community in general is sort of inherently poly. It's sort of taking a stand to be monogamous in my community. So from your perspective, have you noticed more people kind of coming into this type of relationship, like open and poly stuff?
Oh, absolutely. So it's really followed the trajectory of my new career. I was a journalist before I became a therapist. And then Alex and I opened up our relationship around the same time that I was becoming a therapist. And so there was this kind of natural gravitation that I had towards working with folks who were non-monogamous or exploring non-monogamy. Even kind of trying to control for that. And in that short arc of time, there are more people contacting me and my colleagues almost every week saying that they're interested in exploring non-monogamy or some kind of non-traditional relationship, and they're looking for folks who have some area of some expertise around that, or comfort level with it, or an ability to just communicate around it. So I do think that there is a real trend there, and it may speak to our city specifically, but
oh gosh, yeah.
I think generally, I wrote an article last spring about trends in non-monogamy and related to COVID. And again, hard to find data, but there is some data showing that more broadly than in Seattle or in the Pacific Northwest, there is a national trend in this direction too. It's hard to track and it's still relatively small, but there is some kind of trajectory there.
I love that.
Me too.
I love options for people. I support my monogamous friends, my non-monogamous friends, my confused friends. Like, I think the more options, the better, right? With intimacy.
And the opportunity to be creative and collaborative and for it to feel more fun than scary. I know I was thinking about that, like when you were talking about what you wish for like little little boys in a world where it seems like they have few options. And I was like, yeah, I would want for kids growing up now to be able to think about how they have sex and who they have sex with and the types of relationships that they have, that feels more creative and fun than scary and shameful. Like, I just want to be able to move the needle in that direction, you know?
Oof. Oof. Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Please.
It does really feel like the criminalization of sex work is like kind of at the center of that too. It's like as long as that's a thing, it's kind of it's like sending this very strong message that there's something wrong with sex, right?
Absolutely. That's the intent. That's what they mean to do. And I don't think as many people as we think hate sex work. But I think that it completely undermines power in the United States to be able to charge for that type of companionship. And I don't ever see it being decriminalized, honestly,
Really?
as the state stands now. Yeah, I don't.
Why do you say that? Because you think it would be so threatening?
I think that everything would have to be completely different for how power works in the U.S. for it to be decriminalized.
Are you talking about like the power inside of relationships, like that, or tell us a little bit more about what you mean?
Well, I mean, I said it, I think, before in the podcast, and it's kind of a line that I use a lot, is that this country was founded by Puritans who specifically hated sex. And it is written into almost anything and everything, sort of the limitation of who is allowed to have it, why they're allowed to have it. We're still debating gay marriage, which is just shockingly true. And that is, I don't know, indicative of, I think that we've as a country swingled.
Swingled. I like swingled.
Swingled, yeah. We swingled pretty far in one direction in the last few years, which was a really open direction, a really human direction, a really, I don't know, yeah, a really open-minded direction. And now the other side is sort of swinging back pretty hard. And I don't foresee as our country stands now, I do not foresee decriminalization of sex work on a federal level ever.
That has the ring of deep truth in it, and it also is making me feel really depressed.
Yeah, and I think that there's still beauty and hope, and I think that the world is a bad, hard place, but it's also a beautiful place. And I think that what I do is right and what I do is good. And I have to believe that in my heart and be proud of what I do and not depend on society to tell me I am good and right.
Yeah, which is hard work.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just a little take.
Yeah. Vaughn, thank you. That was a very beautiful take there at the end, too, about having to hold for yourself and having a community that helps hold us in choices that the culture doesn't reflect back. And still being able to say, we are good and what we do is valuable and important. And we know that even if we live at a time that tells us otherwise.
Yeah, and it's hard work to do that, or it's taxing, and definitely, I mean, just in a smaller way, being non-monogamous, you have to carry some of that, right? You have to justify your choices and really believe that it's okay and you're not doing something wrong, even when there's a lot of messages that are telling you that.
You really do. You're not going to get a lot of kudos culturally. I mean, at best, it's made fun of or taken lightly, right? In popular culture, sort of joked about, poly stuff.
Yeah.
It's almost never like, I think is Will and Jada, they're poly. Is that right?
They are.
And cliche thing for me to say.
They're amazing. They are
I think
probably
it's cool as hell.
It is cool as hell, and they're just so chaotic. I mean, part of what is wild about it.
Like they're on the same
They're
page about it?
They are, but they have like gone back and forth between like making that announcement and retracting it, you know? So it's like that's the chaos of it. It's like at this point, everyone's like, yeah, you guys clearly are or have gone through periods where you were, you know? So.
Yeah, last season on the podcast, we had a clip from an interview with them where they were like very, very haltingly and painfully like talking
Admitting
about their decision to be poly or how it played out.
Well,
Yeah,
also,
which is
go ahead.
sorry. I mean, we all know those couples, right, that are chaotically poly. I'm like, I know
point.
chaotically monogamous people too.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Chaos
Thank
comes
you.
for everyone. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and I was even just thinking about, you know, the acknowledgement of the hard work that people have to do to hold themselves and their values and their goodness in their community, no matter what this culture says about them. And of course, for folks, the less privilege and less representation you have around your identities and their intersections, whether that's race, class, sexuality, or monogamy and non-monogamy, or the work that you do, the harder and heavier that can be, and the more taxing that can be. And also then the deep like joy and resonance when you find more people that can help you do it and reflect that goodness back.
Absolutely.
I don't know how to segue out of something like that beautiful and deep into these like what seem to be these like they seem like these kind of not flip but like silly things to talk about. But I really wanted to ask Vaughn about unicorn hunting and Twitter.
Oh yeah.
Those two things intersecting, or
I don't know if they have intersections, but Vaughn will tell me if they do.
On Twitter.
Let's go, unicorn hunter. Let's do it.
Well, okay.
What's the question?
The question is just, as a bi-queer woman, I love having sex with folks all across the gender spectrum, and I like having sex with men and women at the same time. And I knew pretty early on in becoming non-monogamous that one of the things that I was going to want to do is have sex with another woman and a man at the same time. And then immediately realized that this was considered kind of a problematic or potentially problematic behavior. And so I have thoughts of my own about this, but I would just love to hear from you. Do you have folks coming to you who are like, we want to have sex in this configuration, but we don't want to be shitty unicorn hunters, or people are kind of suspicious of us? And also, what are your thoughts more broadly about it?
More broadly. Okay, this is a Pandora's box.
I know.
And luckily, here we are. So let's go. I think that it can be, so it's not inherently a bad thing to be unicorn hunting. I think that where the sentiment comes from is from queer communities who have experienced sort of, what is it called? They're sort of required to be attracted to, or required to be heterosexual, and they feel like when dating apps are being used and just one picture of one partner is being used,
I see.
That's sort of a bit of a honey trap, and then it's either later in conversation while they've matched or whatever, that the other partner is mentioned, or it's the last photo in the options or whatever, you know. They sort of feel like, oh, they're trying to trick me. That's where that comes in. Now, I think that, you know, first photo is both partners, and the headline is like looking for a third. Like that to me is like pretty upfront right there. But doing it the other way feels sort of disingenuous and like sort of trying to trick someone a little bit and like show that the lady's pretty, you know, and then show the
her troll has
cis-male partner, the cis-male partner, and he's out, you know.
It reminds me of, I used to do hitchhiking a little bit when I was younger, and the classic, like, I would stand on the side of the road with like one spaghetti strap off my shoulder and my thumb out, and then, like the boyfriend would be hidden behind the backpack.
The bushes, Does that ever really work though? Not with hitchhiking, but with like it's not like you're going to trick anybody actually, right? Like,
I think that, well, that's, Has it worked? I have no idea. I've not known anyone who that's worked with. But it's maybe sort of happened so much that we've all sort of regarded it in this. We're like, oh, come on, like, what are you doing? But yeah, I don't know if it works. I bet it must have. I mean, people do it enough that, right? It must.
It
have
wouldn't
worked.
be a phenomenon. We wouldn't have a term for this if there wasn't some
okay, you're
depth
saying
of
that's what
experience
unicorn
in all
hunting
directions.
is. Yeah. I mean, I've also heard it framed like trying to get a woman involved with a couple in a way where her sort of autonomy or like her wants and desires are kind of erased in comparison to the couple, and she's just
Oh yeah.
What's going on between the couple is what really matters, and
Yeah.
and maybe that's where you come in sometimes.
Well, yeah. So that's a great point. The other, I think, point of tension or contention is that when people are unicorn hunting, they sort of see the third as just someone whose emotions aren't as important as theirs, or whose relationship to the others or mental health isn't as important as the two people who are together, right? And so that's where something sort of funny and lightly like, oh, what are these people doing on this dating app becomes like actual emotional like irresponsibility.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I absolutely hear that, and I've seen that. But and that's where someone like me can come in, because best case scenario, we have great boundaries, right? And we are, for some reason, queer people are attracted to sex work, and sex work is attracted to queer people, and that's a whole other podcast. But
Sure is.
you get a lot of people in my job who like their work and like to do the thing with two people. I don't want to be like crass, but who enjoy couples. So, and that's why some of us even mention in our ads or on our websites, like, we are the unicorns you're hunting. Hello,
Here we are.
hand raised, tis I. Which is what I love. I personally love seeing couples. Yeah.
What do you love about it, Vaughn?
I just really do honestly love people, and then I get to hang out with two people instead of one. I get to see people interact. I get to hear about their process of coming to see me. I get to meet people who are pretty open-minded in relationships that are working really well enough to come see me, right? I get to meet people who respect my profession, who are fairly versed in what I do, have read at least a few articles. When couples come to me, they're very much like that. So we often have a lot in common. So just off the top of my head, those are a few things.
I love how romantic that is. In sort of, it's like maybe in contrast to assumptions that people make about the experience of group sex or people going to sex workers or everybody's reasons involved. There's just like a lot of sweetness and just like romance in that too.
God, yeah. And I just love seeing couples together too. And whenever we're all doing our thing and they're doing their thing together, I get to witness these two people in love. And they may be doing some dirty thing. Like, it doesn't matter what they're doing, but they love each other. And I'm like, hell yeah.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I love that. And I was thinking about, and I know we're at 11 o'clock and I'm not going to take up any more time, but just thinking about how a ribbon throughout this podcast has been, how do we define non-monogamy? And I just got a hit of that when you were saying, I'm like, it has something to do with love and having a complex view of it and a lot of like wide open creative space for what it looks like.
Yep.
I have one more question that I want to ask, and we don't have to include it necessarily, but if you're comfortable answering it, I like to always think about like what is the burning question that listeners are going to have, and I think in this case it might be, how do you not get in trouble? Right, you're doing something that's not legal, and here you are like talking about it on our podcast. How does that work?
Or how, if people wanted to go to a sex worker,
Yeah.
are there ways to do it
Yeah,
where you
that's a
wouldn't
great-
get in trouble?
that's a
Like,
great
I feel
question.
for
Yeah.
like a lot of our
Right.
listeners,
We've
that's
established
probably
that.
what they
We've
want to know.
established we don't think it's
Yeah.
unethical,
Right.
but it is still illegal. So how do
Right.
we go about that? Yeah.
I think Google is your friend. So to answer your question, I think if couples or people are interested in seeing a sex worker, that all of our services are not the same. And none of us would ever do anything illegal if we knew it was. And that for anyone interested in seeing an escort, companion, sex worker, Google is your friend. Do your research. We're out here. We're often kicked off of platforms, but we're often on those platforms too. You can get a good idea of who we are on those platforms. And then from there, kind of choose how you want to move forward. It's going to depend on where you're at in the world, different kinds of criminalization or not. But we are everywhere, actually. And we are all so different from each other. So there's someone for everyone.
I love that.
Yeah, thank
That's
you.
great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else that you want to add or mention?
Did we hit more on, because you mentioned being a therapist and how your labor is not seen as sort of cheating on your spouse, even though you're doing a lot of emotional work with folks?
I think that it's just fascinating to look at this type of work, this type of labor. You listed some of it, often feminized, absolutely essential, and often sometimes taboo. In some places, it's become, there's like a way to become certified and legal and paid. And I have found that in becoming a therapist. And there's a lot of ways in which it isn't, right? And I just think that's just like really interesting to consider.
No, it's super interesting. And I was going to say it's something that sex worker circles talk about all the time. We bring up therapists and we say,
Really?
yeah, we say therapists aren't criminalized, and
Right.
therapists are people who see some wild stuff and who know the deep ins and outs of someone's emotional landscape in this way that because there is no physical aspect of touch involved is not criminalized. And how what we do is sometimes that not often, a lot, we know we're not therapists, but we do often see people's sort of deep and hidden emotional landscapes and try our best to show up for them. And it's wild how we are criminalized, but
Yeah.
therapists are not for reasons. I mean, a surgeon cuts into your body. How intimate is that?
Right.
A nanny raises your children 8 hours a day. I can't think of a more intimate thing, honestly, than to have my hands on someone else's child. Like, that is so intimate. But sex workers are criminalized because of who we are, of feminized labor, of how power works. Yeah. So anyway, I just loved what you had said about being a therapist.
Likewise, I'm like got the tingles. I'm
Yeah.
like, whoa, yeah.
I feel like the conclusion here is to criminalize therapy.
Obviously, obviously,
Yeah.
That's what you're saying,
That's
right?
what we
And
should
childcare. And
Yeah.
childcare.
And childcare.
Childcare and then therapy.
It's really going to bolster the prison industrial complex if we can just
Yeah.
criminalize all this stuff.
Now you're thinking.
Yeah.
Now you're thinking.
Yeah.
Vaughn, this was so great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I really know that we've had a good conversation when I'm like, well, I want to have 12 more conversations based on the things that we touched on today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Thank you so much for listening to Mistakes Were Made. You can find us on Instagram. We'll be back in 2 weeks when our guest will be an actual unicorn, a woman who has dated couples before, and we'll talk about the dynamics of thruples. So talk to you then.